this is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.
Body Bags with Joseph Scott Moore. How? What? When? Why? Those questions are always asked when it comes to death investigation. They always are. And I think that when we begin to distill down the nature of death and what brought an individual to, let's say, their end, it's not necessarily as simplistic as you might think that it is. Sometimes it can be very complex. But the beauty of death investigation is the individuals are no longer with us. And as impatient as folks can be sometimes, we still are afforded the ability in the medical legal community to take our time and to really think about these sorts of things. You know, when it comes down to cause and effect, and a word that many don't normally associate with death, and that's mechanism. I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bags. I think, Dave, that when many people think of individuals who had, say, for instance, participated in IV heroin abuse, and we give them a manner which surprisingly most of the time is going to be ruled as an accidental death, which for me has always been a bit lacking, I think, because, you know, we've been taught for years and years, little ones are always taught in school, you know, drugs are bad, just say no, going back to Nancy Reagan. People have been taught, they've been told, but yet a drug OD is generally ruled as an accidental death, but yet the individuals were actively participating in activity that has a certain expected level of lethality. But the actual cause of death might be heroin overdose, but what else can, you know, kind of play into this? Well, here's something that most people don't think about. The cause of death is, in fact, heroin overdose, but the mechanism for the death is actually cardiorespiratory failure. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that, with a drug OD like this, and it's not just heroin, you can have it with, say, for instance, Coke. It leads to the lungs becoming very edematous. They can't process oxygen anymore. And so also there are electrical problems with the heart and the functioning of the heart, receiving the little impulses from the brain that cause our heart to beat in a normal rhythm. That's actually the mechanism of death. But, you know, it's one does not happen without the other. So the individual would, in fact, have to have injected themselves with heroin in order to bring about this mechanism, which ultimately leads to death.
Well, you know, one thing that bothers me, well, there's plenty, but one in particular, and I remember with the death of Dana Plato of Different Strokes. Yeah. She had gone on the Howard Stern show and got pretty bagged up there, and she'd had her battles with drugs over time, mostly prescription drugs. And she went back home to Arkansas or wherever where she was living in a motorhome with her boyfriend, and she overdosed on like hydrocodone or something along those lines. Mm-hmm. And her death was ruled as a suicide because they said she must have intended to kill herself by taking the pills because she took them regularly and knew how much it would take to kill her. And I've always found that an odd ruling, but it's a legal thing in the state that she died, where when somebody dies of a drug overdose, if they're a drug user, they just label it that way. And I've oftentimes wondered about how somebody's personal lifestyle comes into play when it comes into the death rulings. I'm going to put plural on that because cause, manner, mechanism of death. You start looking at it like that, and most of us don't. That changes everything. Because
it
I don't think
does.
she meant to kill herself. That one in particular, I think she was trying to feel better, and to rule it as suicide is just, I think, is bad.
And here's the other thing: she's not a pharmacologist,
right?
Okay, because if you're trying to and you're trying to tell her, that this level will take you out. I think maybe for her, it's an unexpected outcome.
It almost is like saying if you smoke cigarettes, you're committing suicide.
Yeah. Some people have actually referred to that, or any kind of activity that is detrimental to your health. I sat in a lecture one time, many years ago, where a guy, the whole theme of the lecture was passive suicide. And
lifestyle choices.
I mean, it's like, I don't eat it anymore. My favorite thing in the world, and I'll go ahead and give them a shameless plug right here, is Popeye's chicken. I'm from New Orleans. I love Popeye's chicken. They're not as good as my granny's, but I do love their red beans and rice. I make great red beans and rice, by the way, as well. Used to love their dirty rice when they had it. I could go on and on and on and sing the praises of.
Need to get a salesperson on the phone with Popeyes right now.
Yeah, with Popeyes. Love that chicken from Popeyes. You begin to think about that. I should know better. And particularly, as many hearts as I've participated in the dissection of, where I've seen, significant coronary occlusion as a result of, taking these foods on, but yet it persists, right? The number one killer in America is heart disease. It has been for a long time. I think that we don't normally think about it. But yet there it is. It's there. Listen, let me tell you something. And I think I even showed you an image of this some time ago. There's a classic image that I took at a death scene one time of two fellows sitting in the front seat of a vehicle. And they had done time together in the joint in Georgia. They had been cellies together. And one got out, and he promised. They were both addicted to heroin when they arrived at the lockup at the state prison. And of course, as many people understand, and God bless families that have to endure addiction, with their loved ones. Heroin is not something easy to kick. It's an absolute horror show. But you go into lockdown, and dude, you're going to kick it, because most of the time you're not going to have access to what you had on the outside. But a promise, and this always kind of stuck in my brain as a death investigator and as a human. The one guy told his friend who was still incarcerated, the day that you get out, he was getting out like a month in advance. The day that you get out, it's almost like that scene in the Blues Brothers, where Elwood picks up Jake at the gate. He says, I'm going to be out here. I'm going to be here in my car. I'm going to pick you up. And brother, me and you, we're going to Atlanta, and we are going to party. Well, they did. And let me tell you something that's really going to shock, because it still shocks me even when I see the image. And I show this image every semester in my class. Both of these guys, I'll never forget. I don't know if you did this with your kids, but do you remember back years ago when the Gap would sell 4th of July T-shirts, and they would have an American flag or something patriotic on the front of it, and it would say like 4th of July, 1999 or something. Well, one of these guys was wearing one of those shirts, and he was seated in the front seat. I'll never forget, it was a Jeep Cherokee. The driver was holding a syringe. He's dead now, okay? Keep in mind, I'm a death investigator. Unlike, what my wife first said, when I told her what I did for a living, I'd tell her about some horrible crime or some horrible case, and she'd say, did they die? And it's like, honey, I worked for the medical examiner. They were dead. This guy's sitting there in death holding a syringe, okay? The other fellow is in the front passenger seat, Dave. He's not holding the syringe. the syringe is still stuck into the palmar aspect of his left forearm. And there was a big bottle cap in the center of the console on the armrest that had cotton stuffed down in it. And they had been cooking their heroin in there and then drawing it up and injecting. And the thing about it is that these two fellows, of course, their tolerance level, because they had detoxed, had dropped so low that they decided to hit one another up with the same bolus of drugs. And they actually died. I can still tell you where it is. The building doesn't exist anymore. They died in the back parking lot of the GE headquarters building in northwest Atlanta.
Wow.
And it was hidden. It was one of those places that you wouldn't see from the road. They'd gone back there specifically to get high. And I thought about that, and it was so powerful at that moment in time when you begin to think about the manner and the cause of death. And then, the mechanism relative to this, because this is their deaths, and they were both purple, cyanotic, which would give you an indication at the scene that they were in respiratory distress. You look at that and you think, just for that fleeting second, they had an opportunity to pull back, and all it took was that simple injection, and it drove them to death at that point in time. And I think a lot of people get confused when we begin to talk about how does actually the mechanism of death work. Because it's real easy for us to kind of gloss over and say, well, yeah, it's a heroin OD. And you don't think about that very much. And even in a therapeutic environment, like in a hospital, when somebody comes in and they have OD'd on heroin, yes, they are treating them for heroin usage, but they're actually trying to stem what's going on with the mechanism to bring them back, from the brink. They're like, if you have some kind of respiratory failure thing going on, well, that's going to be the mechanism that leads to the death that was initiated, which is going to be the causal factor with heroin, but they're actually treating the mechanism. Isn't that kind of fascinating, Dave?
Now, that's where Narcan is used as a reversal agent on people who overdose on narcotics, correct?
Yes. Yeah. It kind of mutes the effect. And there's been a lot of lives saved by it.
Yeah.
There's been cops' lives that have been saved by Narcan. There was one real recently. I actually saw it. Lord have mercy. It was terrible. This cop had been exposed.
It was a traffic stop, and he couldn't figure out what was wrong with the person who was driving, and opened up something that looked like makeup. He thought he was going to find weed or dope, some type of dope, and it was actually fentanyl.
Fentanyl, yeah. And
he breathed it in. He didn't start freaking out until after he knew he wasn't feeling right. But on his way back to headquarters, it hit him, and they had to come and save him on the side of the road, gave him a Narcan shot. And I think it was more than one.
Yeah, it was actually. And, and that's happened multiple times. But, when you think about that, okay, let's just think about that for a second. All right. That event. Now, I'm not here to conflate mechanism and manner. However, the mechanism, manner, and cause are all kind of intertwined together. Can we go back to manner just for a second?
Please, actually, I was going to ask you to please do it again. Cause, manner,
let me just throw this out to you, brother. Okay, because it'll kind of make your head swim a little bit.
Mine already is, Joe. Just giving you a heads up.
Well, I've got another case that we'll talk about that's fascinating too. I think.
Hey, very quickly before we move too much further.
Yeah.
You made a comment about the guys that got out of prison and decided they were going to get high because they were cellies and they were looking forward to getting high.
Right.
In my private life, one of the things that I do is I work with alcoholics and addicts in finding sobriety. And I will never forget a call several years ago. A young man had come through the program. It was a year inpatient program. Okay. Very intense and Bible-based. Graduated the program and he went home. And his first month home, he went back to heroin. It's that tempting. And he died of an overdose. And his father called wanting us to tell graduates, if you're going to use, don't start at the level you stopped.
Right.
And I'm like, I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
But the reality is we're not going to tell people how to use drugs to stay alive.
Yeah.
We're going to tell them don't use drugs. That's what they've spent a year learning. I know it's an addiction. I know that it's a self-inflicted addiction. You know, it's the person. And whenever we start talking about this, my heart breaks for the families. My heart breaks for the people that have to deal with the aftermath of you spent all that time in a program and you went out and you spent all that time in prison and you planned on getting high and you died. Yeah. That's why I just wanted just a little PSA. Please have a heart for those who are addicted. It is not a choice. Nobody grows up saying, I want to be a junkie. Nobody says, I want to go to jail. Nobody says, I want to be homeless, all for the sake of drugs. If a mother's love, a child's love for a parent, or, you know, if that could save anyone, there would be no junkies. There would be no addicts.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
absolutely.
But that's why I'm glad you gave that example, Joe. Think about it. You're in a jail cell for your own behavior, and your game plan is let's get high.
It's absolutely insidious. So, if you think about the police officer that we had mentioned, and this didn't happen to him, he survived, but let's just say a similar set of circumstances going back to Manor, and we know that the mechanism is going to be a respiratory failure event, you know, coupled with cardio problems. Let's just say, for an instance, and I really want not just you, Dave, but everyone out there to kind of think about this. If you were the coroner, if you were the medical examiner, how would you rule on the case I'm about to tell you about, where you have a similar circumstance where the police have made a stop along the roadway, okay? And they find somebody passed out in a car. Maybe they're not dead. And then they begin trying to understand what's going on. They're searching the vehicle, and all of a sudden they open up a package and a big puff of powder comes out. They breathe that in, okay? There's nobody there with Narcan. And they die. The person in the car survives. Do you charge that person with homicide? And that's one of the things that kind of, when you begin to think about, I say, do you? Well, will the medical examiner present this to the DA in such a way that the DA begins to understand the mechanism of this event coupled with the causal factors, and how are they going to rule it? I encourage anybody that to check this guy out. He help me out, Dave. What's the name of the town in Pennsylvania where they played Little League World Series?
Williamsport, Pennsylvania.
Well, they play the Little League World Series there. It's famous. It has been famous for that for years and years. And the coroner, they have elected coroners in Pennsylvania, and the coroner up there became quite famous over this one idea. And it's a way of looking at death and the world and through a particular lens. He started ruling. Now, dig this. He started ruling every death that was drug related, that was like from illicit drugs. He ruled every one of those deaths in his jurisdictions as homicides. Every single one of them. And the impetus behind that from his perspective was that these people that are addicted to drugs, who are very vulnerable, were going to a central location and receiving a deadly substance from an individual. And whether or not the dealer pushed the plunger on them, which is the way the attorney would look at that, was irrelevant to him. He was going to rule as the medical legal authority that these were all homicides. Now, I've talked to other coroners around the country over the years since I read that article so long ago. And they don't necessarily agree with it. First off, I think it's more of a practical thing. They, in their jurisdictions, and I think this worked out with this gentleman as well, the prosecution didn't have I don't know if it's the intestinal fortitude or they didn't have the foresight relative to this to enjoin with the coroner and say, yeah, these are homicides. Because in the past, anytime that you have an OD, most of the time, the coroner / medical examiner, forensic pathologist is going to rule that as an accidental death. That's just the way it works. And so
that makes sense, Joe, because how far do you take that?
Yeah.
I mean, do you take it to the guy at the convenience store that sold the 12-pack of beer to the alcoholic who got in the car, drove down the road, and crashed into a tree? I mean, that's a slippery slope to go down. I remember it was Williamsport, Pennsylvania. You are right. I remember that.
Yeah.
And I remember it like it was yesterday, because at first my knee jerk was, wow, you go, man. My second was, no way. But do you really get into that nitty gritty as the, medical legal death? I'm thinking manner, cause, mechanism, and how impactful that is on the actual charging that takes place. Because now I'm back to, I hate to keep doing this, but the whole Karen Reed O'Keefe thing, they don't have manner, cause, mechanism, right? They got one of the three.
Well, with mechanism, they actually do have a cause of death with that. And again, going back to that and it's actually a great example, Dave. I'm glad that you brought that up, because the mechanism with John O'Keefe's death is it's not going to just be simply blunt force trauma, but you have to also think about the physiological response that the brain is having. You recall from our previous episode where I was talking about the fracture complexes that he had in his brain. Well, that leads to a certain outcome where you will have the brain responding to the point where the brain will actually herniate, and the brain is becoming very congested, and it compromises the brain's ability to function appropriately, and that leads to death. That is that mechanism. Yeah, he sustained blunt force trauma, but there is an underlying mechanism that's making that happen. But the thing about it is this. In cases where medical examiners and coroners are having to make a determination, particularly as it applies to the difference and the linkage between mechanism and cause, some things are obvious and some are just not quite as clear. Many years back, Dave, I, along with my colleagues, worked a case involving a young man. And this young man was breaking into homes and either stealing from the homes, which is actually burglary, or he was robbing the occupants of the home if they were there. Okay. So, burglary, you break in, you're not really having contact with people, you're stealing stuff, you're a thief. All right. Robbery is different. With robbery involves, I think a lot of people kind of miss the point with robbery. Robbery involves almost a threat of violence, when this happens. You either give me what you have or else. Well, there's no truer definition in this case. This young man had broken in to this elderly gentleman's house, and to go back, this guy was a World War II veteran. He was widowed, had lived in the same house since he got home from World War II. All right. And he had health problems. The young man came in through the rear door of the home carrying an unloaded pump shotgun. The old man met him in the kitchen, and this young kid took the shotgun and racked it in the old man's face. The old man clutched his chest and died. That kid was charged and tried for malice murder, and he was sent to the penitentiary. Now, you begin to think about that, because most of the time, if a firearm is involved and the case is ruled as a homicide, you're going to begin to kind of contemplate, well, where are the gunshot wounds? Because we're talking about the cause of death. And in a case like that, if you're thinking about somebody being shot with let's just say, buckshot, The cause of death is going to be a gunshot wound. And the mechanism is if they're shot in the chest, their heart, because of the trauma it's sustained in the lungs, they're going to fail. And that's the mechanism relative to that. He was never injured. The old man was never injured. He went into asystole, which means his heart stopped beating because it was literally, I think a lot of people would be inclined to say, well, he was scared to death. This is one of those cases where you can have someone that is subjected to this. They're already in frail health. And that to me was always kind of a touchstone case that I've used over the years to teach people with. Because, my students, particularly undergraduates, when they hear that story, they see it as being implausible. But, Dave, death comes in all shapes and sizes, and you never know how it's present, and then it's going to present for you. And then how are you going to interpret your findings? Not just what you find in the morgue, okay, because many times those things are quite obvious. Sometimes they're not, but many times they're quite obvious. But also the circumstances surrounding the death. And that leads you down a different road. You think weapon, you think gunshot wound. In this case, we had weapon, no gunshot wound, but yet we have a dead body. Some people have actually suggested that there needs to be a sixth manner of death called incompatibility with life. I'll give you an example. There was this guy a few years back that everybody was, weeping and gnashing of teeth over. That's this squirrel suit guy, the guy that puts on the squirrel suit and jumps off the mountain. He's supposed to be the world champion, and he crashes into a rock. I think it's like in the Alps or somewhere. It doesn't matter. It's some huge mountain with rocky outcroppings. Well, he's participating in an activity that, I don't know, many people would say it's incompatible with life. Okay. Now, some people say, well, getting into an automobile is kind of no. That's not, I'm talking about gravity, dude. Okay. Right. You knew the risk when you engaged in this behavior. Is it the same as suicide? I don't know. But that category, if you compare him and what he did to Mamaw that's on her way to church and her, and her land yacht, and she can't see over the steering wheel and she gets T-boned, that's an accidental death. So are those two things the same? So There's a lot of people, and in particularly insurance companies, that would love for there to be a sixth manner of death, incompatibility with life, for instance. Okay?
I will tell you that term, and it's something that I have learned doing this with you over the last couple of years, is sometimes there is evidence found at a scene. And even though you don't have a body, you have enough evidence of blood or other body issues that are incompatible with a person continuing to live based on what you found right here in the front seat of the car. I don't have their body, but I got enough of their body to know they're not alive. Working on a case like that right now. Out of California, the woman's been missing a couple of years, Heidi Planck. And Heidi Planck went missing, and they saw her on a video screen at 6:30 walking her dog. 30 minutes later, her dog is on the 28th floor by himself, and she's gone. Don't know where she went. They found her vehicle, and they found other evidence inside the apartment that the police said is incompatible with life, but they didn't find her body. So
yeah, and that part of incompatibility is not so much an action as it is, say, like jumping off the side of a mountain in a squirrel suit. I didn't think that I would wake up this morning actually say that phrase, but here we go. That's that. Compared to incompatibility with life, if you have a case, say, for instance, involving what's referred to as exsanguination. Exsanguination is the famous or the $10 term for bleeding out, okay, where if you have copious amounts of blood that's left behind, tissue, that sort of thing, then you look at that, even absent the body, and you say, well, yeah, this is incompatible with life, with her having survived. There's a high probability she's deceased. And so you try to marry that up with how the death is going to be classified. With Ms. Planck, there's no way, I don't think, that you could come up with an actual cause of death. Let's say that you were going to try to generate a death certificate for her in her absence, in the absence of the mortal remains, the corpus delicti. You're not going to have enough information because you don't know where the trauma on her person was. You don't know what generated the trauma. You don't know how the trauma was generated itself. And so those are factors that we would look at. And now if you could say that a subject, not her, but just some other subject, had their throat cut, okay, and you had a lot of blood at the scene, there might be certain indications you could tell, well, we've got an arterial spray pattern here and there's a lot of blood. It's soaked all the way through the carpet padding, not just the carpet. And there's a high probability she did not survive this. But even without the body, you can't say that her throat was cut. You just know that they lost a lot of blood. So you look at that and you think, well, back to this idea with Virginia Roberts, so what are you saying? You've given us enough information at this point in time to say that it's a suicide, but if it's a suicide, what's the cause behind the suicide? What is it that has presented to you scientifically that would cause you to rule this as a suicide, but yet you have yet to release the actual cause of death? My suspicion is, if you'd like to hear it, is they're trying to do, I think that they're waiting on toxicology, to tell you the truth.
They are.
That's my opinion.
You know what? A lot of journalists, Joe, a lot of reporters say the wrong thing and they're not questioned on it because everybody you're dealing with is a reporter, journalist, or a lawyer that now hosts a show that often don't have the background that you have. And if I were to offhandedly say that Virginia Roberts Giuffre died, that her cause of death was suicide, 90% of the people are not going to challenge that. They're going to take that for what it is and not even think, wait a minute, he's talking out of his butt. He doesn't even know what he's talking about because that is not what caused her death. Her death was not caused by a suicide, because suicide could be shot in the head, hung myself, cut myself, any number of things.
Well, the problem with that is the level. These are very simple constructs, and it's the level of inexactitude. And this is one of the things that troubles me about that.
That's got to drive you nuts when you're on
it really does. And I'm not some kind of OCD, anal retentive kind of guy. Really, I'm really not. But the inexactitude is the very slippery slope. We get accused in forensic practice, and I think probably law enforcement would agree with this as well, that side of the house, of being sloppy, of being inexact about what we're talking about. The lawyers they feast off of that. But yet you flip that around and you look at these inexactitudes, and the problem, I think, with her death in particular is that, not that other deaths are not important, but there's so much of a swirl around this that you could be so flippant that you don't delve a little bit deeper into this and offer the public more data, because how she died, that is the cause of death, and how you classify that death is so very important that we really can't, you can't just leave that just kind of hanging in the air. You have to be very, very exact about this.
I can see that with her. But, Joe, what about O'Keefe? How do you move forward with a murder trial when you don't have all of the – again, I don't know what was his manner of death. It's undetermined, and we move forward with a murder trial? I would think you'd have to know that.
Well, yeah, you would. But if you look at, talking about cause, if you look at John O'Keefe's death, his specific cause of death is going to be massive head trauma. And let me break this down to you. This is actually kind of fascinating to me. I got to see the forensic pathologist, I got to see her autopsy sketches from, we use in the autopsy room, we use anatomical sketches, and there's hundreds of these things, these diagrams that we use. And there's actually a great one and they demonstrated this in court, where you take off, this is an artist rendering, it's not his actual head, but you take off the skull cap and you're looking down into the floor of the skull, and the brain is over to the side. There's another drawing of the brain over here. And so when you're looking down into the floor of his skull, that's what we call the basilar area of the skull, or like the basement. Okay. That's what it comes down to. Okay. So when you're looking at the basement of John O'Keefe's skull, the forensic pathologist went into great detail of talking about what we refer to as a fracture complex. So when you see John O'Keefe's fracture complex, there are two, and they're distinctly different, but yet in their own right are lethal. And let me break it down. When you see the anterior portion, there are fracture lines that are running all over the place, okay? And it starts right above the orbits of the eye. So one of the thinnest parts of the brain, one of the thinnest parts of the skull are those little shelves that sit over your eye sockets. Matter of fact, they make up the roof of your eye sockets. And Dave, I've actually been able to take a flashlight and have a skull in my hand where the bottom part, and this is an actual skull where it's cut away, and could take the flashlight and place it beneath the floor of the skull. And that bone is so thin that light illuminates up through it. You could light a room with it as almost like it'd be kind of muted, but you could, in a dark room, you could actually see. That's how thin it is. Doctors like to describe it as being eggshell-like. Okay. So he's got this complex of fractures, and they're these kind of curvilinear patterns. And she's drawn this out. I'll never forget, she's used a green ink, which I've never seen anybody do, which I thought was kind of compelling because it's real striking when they put it up on the Elmo. The Elmo is the projector that they use in the courtroom, where you place an item up there and it projects it onto the wall. Of course, now they have an Elmo that's connected to the television screen in there. So you've got that complex. He's got kind of what sounds to me like this avulsion trauma to his right eye. And to me, that speaks of point of impact. And he's got bilateral raccoon eyes, which means he's got basilar skull fractures. Anytime you see somebody with raccoon eyes, either they've been struck in the head or they've had nose surgery. Okay, like reconstructive nose surgery. You'll get the eyes swell up, and you can actually see the edema. I saw the image of him in the morgue, and I think I saw one in the emergency room. And he's got the C collar on, and his eyes are very edematous. They're swollen and blackened. Now, those fracture patterns in there, what that does is that literally opens up the floor, and you get seepage down behind the eyes. The skull is closed, okay? The brain has been traumatized because whatever he was impacted by, whether it was her car or slip and fall, the brain begins to swell as a result of that subarachnoid and subdural trauma. And dude, unlike, let's say you get hit in the arm with a baseball, with a hot shot in the forearm, okay? Now, I know because you're an old baseball guy, you get hit with a hot shot, you draw up a knot, as Granny would say, you draw a knot up on you. And you can actually feel it. But guess what? The skin can expand. Those muscles, as they're traumatized in there, they're filling up with blood. It's an engorgement, and it expands out. Sooner or later, it's going to recede. Brain can't do that. Brain can't do that because the skull is closed. So the brain begins to expand inside of this hard shell. It's looking for some place to go, and it's beginning to get strangled. Okay, and it actually herniates in a few places. Well, not only does he have that complex, but you go to the back of his head, Dave, there is a significant laceration that's in what's referred to as the horizontal plane. And so you think about the vertical plane, top of the head to the soles of the feet. That's vertical plane. You think about horizontal plane, you're talking about from your left ear to your right ear, or from your right shoulder to your left shoulder. That's horizontal. So this thing is literally in the horizontal plane, and underneath it, there's that laceration where he's impacted the ground. Guess what? Separate fracture complex at the base of the brain now. Now it's surrounding the brain stem. The brain is swelling because not only is the floor of the brain fractured, now the brain has been traumatized too. The brain is swelling. It's swelled. The brain swells. I think unlike any other organ, the trauma response in the brain is amazing, and it begins to swell. Well, okay, so I can say to you definitively, I've really started chasing rabbits. I apologize, but we can say that John O'Keefe's cause of death is blunt force trauma of the head. Goes without. I don't think anybody would question that. That's the causative factor here. Okay, but how are you going to rule it? Well, you had mentioned, you made a great comment, and this is kind of it's the juxtaposition between the medical legal community and the prosecutorial community. They feel as though that with that simple cause of death that they have, even though it has not been ruled, it's been left ruled undetermined, they've got enough of circumstantial evidence surrounding those events that night. They feel confident enough that they can push through. But it's a powerful thing when a forensic pathologist gets up on the stand and they can't tell you what the actual manner of death is. They can only state the cause. I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bags.
This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed Human.